The United States pushes forward its ambitious project of a pan-Arab alliance against Iran. But there are deep divisions brought on by the Gulf crisis. So, can Washington's desire to rope in Israel, along with the Arab states, against a common enemy actually succeed? And what does it mean for President Trump's Middle East peace plan? This is Inside Story. Welcome to the programme. Today with me, Peter Dobby. Washington's begun putting together a plan to forge an anti-Iran alliance with the Arab countries. Now, the U.S.Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, has met foreign ministers of the Gulf Cooperation Council states and Egypt and Jordan. They discussed the perceived threats posed by Iran to peace and stability across the Middle East. However, the GCC is, of course, a house divided. Qatar wants the blockade imposed on Doha by some of its neighbours lifted before the U.S. security plan can be considered credible. Hashem Al-Barra sets up our discussion today from New York.
A rare gathering of Gulf rivals. This is the first time Qatar's foreign minister has come face to face with his counterparts from Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain and Egypt, since the four countries imposed a land, sea and air blockade on Qatar in June last year. No handshakes, no smiles and no news conference at the end of the meeting that lasted almost 1 hour. 2 days ago, Saudi Foreign Minister Adil Al-Jubair accused Qatar of financing extremism, adding that his country will be okay even if the crisis goes on for another 50 years.
Qatar can wait also forever, but we have to address the challenges in our region first before we talk about just boycotting like this. Diplomacy means communications, means engagement, and this is Qatar.
Thank you. Thank you. This is Al Jazeera English. Can I ask you a question?
Thank you very much. Thank you.
The war of words between Gulf rivals put the United States of America in a difficult position. The Trump administration is scrambling to put together a regional alliance of countries against Iran, which it sees as a growing threat in the Middle East. During the past few days, the US has ramped up its rhetoric, describing Tehran as the world's leading sponsor of terrorism.
As far as America is concerned,
accusations dismissed by Iran. Saudi officials blame Iran for destabilizing the whole region.
Saudi Arabia believes that in order to achieve peace and stability in the Middle East, what is needed is to deter Iran in its subversive policies. This is sectarianism and interference in the internal affairs of the region. Such aggressive conduct constitutes a glaring breach of all international laws and treaties.
The US wants to address major challenges in the Middle East, including ISIL, wars in Yemen, Syria, instability in Iraq, and what it sees as Iran's growing influence in the region. But its chances of building a united front remain slim as long as the GCC crisis continues. Hashem Al-Barra, Al Jazeera, New York.
Okay, let's get going. Let's bring in our panelists today on Inside Story. From New York, Mahjoub Zweri, Director of the Gulf Studies Center at Qatar University. In Tehran, Mustafa Hosh-Chesham, journalist and political commentator. And from Washington, Hilary Mann-Leverett, former US State Department official and now CEO of the political risk consultancy Strategia. Welcome to you all. Mahjoub, coming to you first. What's the point of this?
I think it's important to put this in a context. This is not the first time that the United States tries to have sort of alliances of coalition against Iran. This was the case pre the deal with Iran, and always there was attempt that the regional players should play a role on isolation, on isolating Iran. That was always the norm of the United States. This was the case against Iraq since 1991. What is new in this is that this comes from the professional diplomat within the Department of State who believes that it is enough to be away from the reality that the United States does need its own alliances in the region, and they need to see more involvement from within the region with their effort to isolate Iran. For this reason, I see that the administration, this is an attempt from the Department of State to be active in isolating Iran and make sure that most of the players within the region are on board, taking into consideration the fact that there is sort of, as we know, there is the Gulf dispute does affect the whole thing, and it basically control the move of the United States and the possibility to see success of all of this effort.
Mustafa, in Tehran, there have been various iterations of something not dissimilar to this. Didn't get off the ground before. Why should or could it succeed this time?
Well, as a matter of fact, my colleague was right. This is not the first time. Actually, there have been similar moves made by, Saudi Arabia in the region in order to establish a front against Iran under various names, like the recent anti-terrorism or counter-terrorism effort. But they have all remained futile. In all these, the United States has been behind Saudi Arabia, but they have never achieved any fruit or any goal, any objective in that. But this time, apparently, the United States is tired of seeing the Saudis fail in their attempts and in advancing their regional designs. Now they have come to take the matters into their own hand. Originally, with regard to Iran in recent years, the Saudis were given the role by the U.S. in their regional design to, subdue all PGCC member states, establish an alliance against Iran, and then widen such an alliance to the Arab world. But in their first step, when they came forward to subdue Qatar with regard to its winning aces that it had, with regard to its influential ties with Muslim Brotherhood, with Hamas in the Palestinian issue, the militants in Syria, especially in eastern Ghouta, as well as their good ties with Iran, the Saudis failed after more than a year or two, around nearly 2 years of laying siege on Qatar. And eventually, actually, what the Saudis did was in Iran's favor. When they started meddling in Syria, Syria called for Iran's help and Iran's influence grew. When they laid siege on Qatar, Qatar saw Iran as its rescue path, and the two countries, Iran and Qatar, saw a new chapter in their cooperation and ties. So when they failed in all these attempts, the United States seems to be intolerant, and now they are taking matters into their own hands, probably. But of course, that's why probably the foreign ministers of Qatar, Kuwait, and Oman in their recent meeting in New York gave a positive, response when they called Iran a threat and stressed on, diffusing Iran's influence in power or containing Iran's influence and power in the region.
Mustafa, I just want to boil that down, what you've just been saying there. I just want to boil that down and put that central point to Hilary Mann Leverett in Washington. Hilary, obviously the US sees Iran as a threat for US strategic interests in the region and also US security in terms of the GCC, but very clearly as well in terms of Israel. Are those worries accurate and justifiable?
Well, I think it's important to put that into a strategic context. Today, it's Iran. Today, it's the Islamic Republic of Iran that sits in the Middle East, this region that the United States has, since World War II, designated as vital to American national security interests because of the oil that it generates, the oil that not only it could send to the United States, but that it sends to Europe and Asia. Whoever has decisive strategic influence, if not control over the oil, not only has decisive strategic influence and control in the Middle East, but really around the world. So this is an overriding strategic interest for the United States, regardless if it's a Democratic or Republican administration, whether it's Trump today or if it had been Hillary Clinton. And it's also true regardless of whether it's the Islamic Republic of Iran today or if it was another independent power. The key issue here is independent military power, especially independent Arab or Muslim power. So today, it's an independent Muslim power in the Islamic Republic of Iran that is strong and can defy the United States as it continues to try to strengthen a highly militarized pro-American political and security order. But in prior decades, it was Saddam Hussein's Iraq that stood at the precipice of strong, independent military power in the Middle East. And before that, it was Gamal Abdel Nasser's Egypt that challenged the United States. So this is not new in terms of the regional dynamics, and it's not new in terms of the dynamics in Washington. But it's also important to keep in mind that today, it's critically important for the United States, as policymakers see it here in Washington, this is not my personal opinion, to keep the Islamic Republic of Iran itself weak, divided, and sapped of its energies, keeping it constantly entangled in military conflict, and to pair that with emboldening Israel and having countries that would challenge Iran to be tied to an alliance that includes Israel. Because once you're in an alliance in the Arab and Muslim world with Israel, there's really no turning back, because your populations don't support that. So the only way that you as a government can get support to continue to be part of that alliance is to stay aligned with the United States. So for policymakers here in Washington, those two goals are very important to have together.
Okay, Majid, you wanted to come in there.
Yeah, I think there's an important or significant issue here related to what the United States is doing. Previously, the United States used to go to the region with sort of coalition with the European nation as a whole, with the European Union, if you may say. And normally, even previously against Iran, Europeans used to be on board. This is the first time where the United States goes to the region solo to have this coalition. As you know, in 2 weeks ago, the three European countries, Germany, UK, and France, in addition to China and Russia, they are working on creating a legal entity so they can avoid the sanction against Iran. So there is sort of a new dynamic as well, which I think puts pressure on the Americans to work with the regional players more, comparing with the past. As I mentioned, the Europeans used to be on board. This is the first time the American is playing solo, and they need more support from within the region.
Well, the proposed security arrangements would be structured on the lines of NATO. That's what it's being called, an Arab NATO. It's reported the US would expect the Gulf nations to foot the bill, and those same countries would be expected to back local groups against rebels supported by Iran in Syria, Yemen, and also inside Iraq. The Middle East Strategic Alliance, MESA, would police 3 strategic waterways: the Gulf of Hormuz, Bab al-Mandab, and the Suez Canal, critical routes for global oil and trade. It's hoped that military cooperation would pave the way to restoring diplomatic ties between Qatar and the blockading states. Washington is also hopeful of including Israel in any deal, as Hillary was mentioning there. And if Israel's relations militarily improve with the Arab countries, then diplomatically conditions would be better to push for Donald Trump's so-called deal of the century for peace in the Middle East. Hillary, can I just put that one back to you? Why is there this need to simplify it in a region that can never be simplified? Why call it the Arab NATO? Because, if you look at countries like Oman and Kuwait, they've had good relationships, granted spasmodically, with whoever's in power in Tehran. So why is there this dynamic to put it in a box and call it something?
I think that really is a political dynamic here in Washington, that it's easier for politicians here to be able to sell it domestically as the United States having this Arab alliance. That's something easier to sell here. I don't think it has real strategic meaning. And you could see that in terms of how the Department of Defense handles it. And it's interesting to see how the Department of Defense is approaching this entire issue. Just as you had Secretary of State Pompeo meeting with the foreign ministers of the GCC states, Jordan and Egypt, you had Secretary of Defense Mattis here in Washington, in fact, calling for, or in fact putting in process, a procedure to withdraw or to draw down the Patriot anti-missile Patriot batteries in Bahrain and Kuwait. So there's a real question about whether the U.S. military is involved. I think it's much more of a political dynamic, and one that President Trump is pushing both to show that he's in control in the Middle East before the November midterm elections here, and as he goes into his 2020 re-election campaign, that he has a firm anti-Iran, pro-Israel strategy with these Arab countries generically defined because he doesn't really care about any of them individually, to give him a political push here in the United States in his domestic politics.
Mustafa, is there a risk as far as the leadership where you are is concerned, and could it possibly be this? If you try to codify the relationship between disparate countries, disparate religions, where those countries are led by reckless leaders, quotes, I'm using the word advisedly, is there a risk here that you make reckless leaders more reckless, more dangerous, if you will?
Well, to be honest with you, I doubt if any of these Arab nations they would take a hostile move against Iran, unless for the kind of terrorist attack that we saw last week that was sponsored, at least according to Iranian officials, it was sponsored by the Saudis, the UAE, and the United States. That's the kind of cooperation that they've been running. You know, in area of military, the United States is trying to advance its regional design. Now, at the expense of the regional states, the Arab states, I doubt if there would be any meaningful or influential and significant military move against Iran. But in area of economy, as well as security and politics, there will be moves, and there have been many moves on the way in the last at least 2 years. Just for example, the United States used billions of dollars of Saudi petrodollars in order to meddle with Iran's foreign currency market in the UAE. Iran has announced that it wants to move its foreign currency market to a number of countries, first and foremost to Qatar and China. Now, as you see, as far as the Saudis were supposed to lead this coalition or NATO, whatever it is, against Iran, the Qataris were never subdued, and the relations improved. But now that the U.S. has picked up the role in order to coordinate affairs, because it's a major world power, the Qataris as well as Kuwait and Oman, they have at least rendered somehow their verbal support for this.
Mahjoub Zweiri in New York, is there potentially here a huge negative, a quid pro quo, if you will? Because if you tether certain Arab countries to this US administration, would certain Arab countries then feel that they have an umbilical cord that could, in theory, pull the US military into very live conflicts? So you could see a situation where external players, say in the 3.5-year ugly war in Yemen, they might then bring to bear an expectation that the US should have military people on the ground engaging in the conflict.
I don't think so. When it comes to the issue of Iran, I think this administration, according to what I know, is more focused on putting more pressure politically on Iran. The issue of regime change has been discussed in the past, and I think this administration maybe is acting as they are moving towards regime change, especially remembering that John Bolton is very close to the president. But there are two main things we have to keep in mind in this context. The first one is that, as I mentioned, the United States now is actually playing solo against Iran, not as it used to be, and I think that will put more pressure on the administration to think or to count until 100 before moving to the any kind of military action or regime change. The second issue, I think there is also doubt about the solidarity and the unity within the region against Iran. I think even the talk about the Arab NATO, it doesn't sound that they believe this can be reality. They need to do a lot before getting to the point where actually they have all of those countries on board. Keep in mind that every one of these countries has its own matters. You look at the GCC and this dispute and its impact on all countries. Look at the situation in Jordan and Egypt. So there are, I think, obstacles which will complicate any kind of further, I would say, benefits to the United States from all of this. However, again, we have to keep in mind that this administration, this administration now is trying to push things, and I think the Secretary of the State Pompeo is getting the message from the White House. They have to be more active on putting pressure on Iran, and that is what they are doing now. And I think in this context, we have to see more action similar to this, and putting more pressure on the country so they can work harder on Iran in the near future, especially with the new sanctions will come in next month.
Understood. Gotcha. Hillary, you've already touched on this point. Can we just flesh this out a little bit? If this is a goer in 6 months or a year, say, and the Arab states say, yes, we're on board. They say, yes, we will fund it. Israel then has to be introduced into that big family relationship as some sort of associate member, as a partner. That therefore then surely changes the mood music across the entire region, which is a plus. But then an Israeli prime minister would presumably be pressured to deliver on something that no Israeli prime minister is ever going to deliver on.
Well, and I think you saw the prelude to that this week in New York on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly, where this extreme pro-Israel group here in Washington called, ironically, the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, called an anti-Iran summit that included the foreign minister of Saudi Arabia, the ambassadors of Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates, and the head of the Israeli Mossad, together with the U.S. Secretary of State Pompeo and National Security Advisor John Bolton. So they've given you this prelude this week of how these countries could work together, how they can appear on the same podium, how they have similar interests. But I wanted to also flag an important point that may be counterintuitive. I think by Secretary of State Pompeo calling together the GCC foreign ministers, the Egyptian and Jordanian foreign minister, it was a message to Saudi Arabia that the United States is no longer so enamored with Saudi foreign policy and what the Saudis have done for the United States, because it really forced the Saudis to accept a lot, to sit at the same table as the Qatari foreign minister, who Adel Jubeir has been saying for over a year that there's no way that the Saudis could ever accept really anything about the current situation in Doha. So it was a very important symbolic subordination of the Saudis, very, very public symbolic subordination. And I think what you see happening is the U.S. government trying to really weaken any or maybe control more of what the Saudis do, and to get them ready to go even more publicly, more often with the Israelis. And whether that in the end leads to any concession from the Israelis, there may be some who hope for that, but there would be absolutely no basis in U.S. foreign policy history to conclude that.
Understood. Very last brief final point to you, Mahjoub Zoueri in New York. If the Arab NATO actually happens, Mr. Trump has got to be seen, surely, within that context, within that framework, as an honest broker of peace in the Middle East. Nobody sees him as that across the region. Not really, not genuinely. So how does he square that, and how does he pay attention to individual needs and individual demands, the kind of demands and the realization of those demands that Hillary was touching on 10 minutes ago?
I think the whole attempt to have this NATO, has strong link with Trump personally and his administration to put something on their record before they move to the second presidency. I think he's keen to have some achievement in foreign policy. Now there is the deal of the century is not moving as they wish. Now that is, it seems to them that's an easy target to achieve, to say there is an Arab NATO. But in reality, this region is very complicated. And since 1993, with the whole debate about peace process facing Iran, all of these efforts actually has failed to achieve anything. And let's not forget, the United States, they wanted Arab country and regional players when they are in real trouble. When they decided to go to the deal with Iran, they forgot their own alliances in the region. Let's remember the deal 2015 done without any consultation with any of those countries, and the United States decided to go with the European Union to sign that deal. So I think some of this is in the mind of the Arab countries, and they remember how the United States left them alone in 2015. For this reason, I think this is an attempt, but I'm not sure will lead to have a serious impact on the region, and or will lead to have a serious fruitful result to Trump himself as well.
Guys, there are times I wish this program was an hour long, not 30 minutes long. Today was one of those days. Thank you so much for your contribution today here on Inside Story. You've been listening to Majub Zweri, Mustafa Hosh-Chesham and Hilary Mann-Leverett. Thank you to you too for your company. Do check out the website. You can watch the program again. Click on the icon aljazeera.com. You can also talk to us via Facebook. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Or talk to us on Twitter @AJ Inside Story. I'm @PeterDobby1. From me and the team here in Doha, thanks for watching. We'll do it all again tomorrow. Bye-bye.